Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Utah Stories. Today we have a recurring guest on the program, Josie White, who is the Development Director for South Vallery Services. How's it going?
Great. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, so we wanted to have her back because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is a really, really important topic. So what does it mean when we say October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month?
That's a great question. Awareness months are to bring awareness to things, but domestic violence is a really large issue, especially in Utah. Rates of domestic violence and sexual assault occur here at rates significantly higher than the national average. And so when we bring awareness to these issues, we can start having the conversations about what it looks like, what to do if you or somebody you know is experiencing it, and then also how to help.
Yeah, that's super important. Can you give us a refresher on the services that South Vallery Services provides?
Definitely. So South Vallery Services runs a shelter in Tooele County and a shelter in Salt Lake County. Both of those shelters are confidentially located because we typically end up seeing clients whose lives are deemed to be at risk. So if their abuser were to find them, it's probably become a homicide victim. And so for the safety of our clients and staff, it's important nobody knows where we are. In Salt Lake County, we also run a case management and clinical program, so therapy and case management services out in the community. In traditional models, people have to stay in a shelter to access services, and we saw a need well beyond outside of a shelter, right? Not everyone who needs services or would benefit from free therapy also needs a place to stay. So we're looking at expanding that program out in Tooele too. And then we do run a prevention and education program in Salt Lake County. So we have staff members traveling around the county teaching people about domestic violence, how to spot it. And the program I'm most excited about for them, it's a healthy relationships course. And so they go into the high schools and teach teenagers about healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics and how to recognize them and respond.
Yeah. Speaking of that, can you talk about what abuse looks like in relationships?
Of course. So abuse is about maintaining, gaining power and control. And so it can take all sorts of forms. I think a lot of people think of physical, but it can also be emotional, verbal, spiritual, economic. Essentially, if something can be used to assert power over or control over another person, it can be utilized as a tool of abuse.
Yeah. On the reverse side, what do healthy relationships look like?
So I would say healthy relationships are based on mutual respect. There should be a friendship present, right? And then shared decision making. In abusive relationships, typically the abuser or perpetrator is the sole decision maker. People end up doing what that person wants to do, regardless of what the other person does. And so that could look like making decisions about the family's finances or the couple's finances, depending, or deciding whether or not the victim can go to school or work. And so there are all sorts of manifestations of that. So shared decision making and mutual respect are really important.
Yeah, that's really important for people to know, especially like younger people who are just getting into relationships. What would you say to someone who says, I think I have a friend who's experiencing domestic abuse and I don't know how to help?
So a great first step, our helpline is for people who see other people in need of services. So people can give us a call in Salt Lake or Tooele counties, and our victim advocates who are specially trained can help familiarize people with services and next steps to help their loved one. And these conversations can be hard to have. You might spot somebody, a loved one, who seems like they're having a really unhealthy relationship. Maybe they're apologizing excessively, they're suddenly running late to everything, not showing up to things, making excuses not to see people, making excuses for their partner's poor behavior. But it's also not uncommon, if you were to ask, somebody might outright deny the abuse. And there are a lot of reasons that happens. It might be because they're trying to protect their abuser, and it might be because they're not ready to confront the severity of the situation. And everybody's on their own path. But even if somebody denies it, the best thing to say is, well, if you ever do need to talk, know that I'm always going to be a resource for you. And so making yourself available to these conversations and just reassuring the person that you're there if and when they're ready to talk about something.
Yeah, I agree. I think definitely the most important thing in that type of situation is to just offer your support, because then the person who's going through a hard time will always know that you're there for them. So.
Yeah, and this seems a little bit counterintuitive, but you actually shouldn't say anything bad about their partner to them, because if you do and they go back, there's an added layer of shame, like, oh my gosh, my friend or my sister told me they're bad and I'm back in this situation. And so abuse has so much shame associated with it, right? Abusers instill a sense of shame and unworthiness in their victim, but the way we all talk about abuse can reinforce that idea, right? This idea of, well, why don't you leave? It's so simple. Or I would just leave. Or I would never find myself in that circumstance. And so we want to take every opportunity we can to reduce shame. And so it takes an average of 7 times for somebody to leave an abusive relationship for good. So that means half the people are leaving more than 7 times. And so we just need to reaffirm for our friends and loved ones, if they're in this situation, that we will always be in their corner.
Yeah, I think that's tricky because it can come off as victim blaming and things like that when you are just not only offering the victim support, but blaming their partner. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of what South Valley Services does for our model too. We get asked quite a bit by funders, what does success look like? And that's hard to answer, right? Because if somebody goes back 7 times and then they leave the 8th for good, does that mean the first 7 times were unsuccessful? Or what if the option for a couple is that they both get sober and do anger management and then their relationship works again? They're not leaving their abuser. So what does success look like? And so we've taken a new approach of defining success as the moment somebody walks in our door seeking services. And we try to reaffirm to our clients that if they come back, they are welcome, and they're welcome for as long as they need services.
Yeah, I mean, taking that first step out of a really, really difficult situation is so brave in the first part. So even if it does take you 7 or 8 times, at least you're getting out of a really bad situation.
Yeah, and I think too, people might not always realize how dangerous leaving can be. It's actually the most dangerous time in any abusive relationship. And so being able to offer support, and whether that's in shelter so they have a safe emergency place to stay, or our case management can also help people come up with exit plans to leave their relationship. So when they do leave, they'll exit into housing and a job, and so there's not a huge turmoil, at least in that sense.
Yeah.
And so giving people the tools they need to leave and then to stay safe are really important.
Yeah, because oftentimes when you leave relationships like that, it can be financially difficult. It can be, physically, physical abuse can come out of it. So there's definitely a lot of hard factors when trying to leave situations like that, for sure.
Yeah, and so just meeting people with understanding is the way to go.
Yeah. What are ways you can help with domestic violence in general?
So I think the first thing to do is to learn the warning signs. And so we talk a lot about red flags and green flags. And red flags can be easy to miss if you're wearing rose-colored glasses. And so being able to kind of trust your gut when you're dating somebody early. A really good example is, all my exes were just crazy. Every single one of them had an issue. It was all them. It was never me, and just a complete lack of accountability in relationships. Even if you do have all bad exes, I mean, a partnership has 2 people, so there's at least something going on there that requires some introspection. So learning those warning signs and knowing what to do if you see them in your own life or in the life of a loved one's really important. And then supporting organizations like South Valley Services, whether that's financially, with your time, or honestly even following people on social media and sharing our content, or even just engaging with it so our reach increases, helps, because violence thrives in silence. And so as long as we're not having these conversations about what violence looks like and how to prevent it, it's going to continue. And as long as there's violence in our community, we're all susceptible to it.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that October is a Domestic Violence Awareness Month, because it is specifically focusing on bringing awareness to these really important issues that oftentimes are silenced. So
yeah, and these can be difficult and uncomfortable to discuss sometimes, but those discussions are worth having. Those discussions can be life-saving, and sometimes uncomfortable discussions are worth having.
Yeah. Can you speak to what it means to survivors that the community tries to help them with this cause?
Absolutely. So, in abusive relationships, a huge component is isolation. And so abusers remove their victim from their friends, their family, all of their connections. And so they end up totally isolated, with somebody reinforcing that you're in this situation because there's something wrong with you. It's your fault. You're lucky to be with me because you're not worth anything. And so having resources people can go to and see that their entire community is behind them and is there to help them, sorry, I get choked up, when they need it, is huge. It counteracts the messages they're getting from their abuser, and it shows that our community cares and we're willing to take action to help them.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. I've had friends in like different situations like this, and I think just knowing that they have resources and that people care about them is just a really important step for sure.
And I think too that sometimes knowing a total stranger cares is reaffirming in a way that's hard to quantify. But knowing, so I do the fundraising for South Valley Services, and I think I'm in a really unique position because working in the shelter, we see the worst of human behavior. And it gets to the point where you're like, surely I've seen it all now. And then something else happens. And it's shocking. But on the other hand, I get to see clients demonstrating unthinkable strength and resilience and courage. And then I also have the added element of working with donors and volunteers who are at humanity's best, right? They're most kind, they're most generous, they're most motivated. And so knowing that that network exists is huge. Knowing that people care and people are there to help is just really reassuring and inspiring.
Yeah, like I said earlier, like victim blaming can like often happen. So hearing the complete opposite of that is just so refreshing and really helps for sure. Is there anything you wanted to add today?
There is always things I want to add, but if I'm not careful, I can just go on and on. I guess I would say if you notice things in your relationship you're worried about, it never hurts to call our hotline. And if you're worried about a friend, it doesn't hurt to call the hotline or helpline. It's both. And if you're in a really dangerous situation, call 911. The Utah State Legislature this year mandated the lethality assessment protocol. So police officers have now been trained on an evidence-based mechanism to assess risk. And our law enforcement partners know how to make referrals and get people in contact with help, whether that's shelter or case management. But there are resources and there are people who are not only able to help, but more than willing. And we're keeping an eye out for your call.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on the program today and discussing this really important topic, and thank you for tuning in to Utah Stories.
Thanks for having me.